Good afternoon. So I'm Tom Hukins. By day, I'm a Perl consultant and developer. I've worked with various companies in and around London doing Perl-related development. And usually at London Perl Workshop, I give a talk about some of the coding things I've been doing. And I've been doing coding this year, as I normally do. But also, I've been spending a lot of my working life going around various people in my team, doing bits and pieces with them, going around people in some of the other teams, which basically means I'm not doing my job and I'm annoying everyone else. So I kind of thought, but I'm still a developer. I'm not a manager. What I'm supposed to be doing is basically writing code. So I was thinking, if I'm not writing code, what am I doing that's development that is not writing code? So I started thinking, well, is development more than writing code? Because when we're writing code, we've got people like managers, people making sure requirements are gathered, people making sure the developers do their job. We've got people doing non-development related tasks. And so I started thinking, well, is development more than writing code? And then I thought, well, not really, because development is the writing code. That's just what development is. But then I thought, well, that's not a very interesting talk or a satisfying answer. So I decided to ask a different question, which seemed less snappy as a talk title, but perhaps a more interesting question. And of course, if any of you want to heckle me, this is probably the best time of the talk to do that. But it would be best not to have heckling. Also, because I normally give technical talks, and this isn't a technical talk, and I'm a technical person, I'd like to take questions at the end, because I'm not really sure if anything that I'm saying makes sense, or if it's correct, or anything. But let's see how it goes. So what else do developers do? Well, if you're going to write code well, and you're not starting from scratch, which after the first day of your work you're not, in order to write code, we need to read through the code to see what's there, to make sure we're not duplicating what already exists, and to make sure that what we're writing fits in with what's already there. So reading code is important. But once you've got a lot of code, or even a little bit of code, and you're forgetful, which I am, then it's not just reading through it line by line, but it's exploring the code, trying to find your way around the code base, not just line by line, but getting a feel for the structure of it, the shape of it. So I want to talk, to start with, a little bit about some of the approaches I use to explore code. Pretty much everyone, I hope, these days uses a version control system, and I think most of us use Git, but this isn't really Git specific. It's really helpful when you're trying to explore a code base to have some kind of repository viewing tool. I work on the command line a lot, and I like a tool called TIG, but there are GUI clients that exist as well. So find something that works for you. A repository viewer lets you explore the commit logs to see what people were thinking when they wrote the code. It allows you to see line by line, when was this introduced, how old is it, and what was the commit message that went with that. Also, good repository viewer gives you a front end around the grep tool, so you can start looking for the names of the methods, the names of the classes, to see what's calling what, and getting a feel for what hangs together. The other tools I've found useful are profilers. Now, things like develcover is more of a coverage tool, but NYTprof people often use for finding slow code. That's the common use of a code profiler. But I've been using NYTprof this year to run either my test suite or bits of the code base I'm working on under NYTprof, not to see whether it's slow, but to see which bits of the code base call which other bits. When I'm working on a particular part of the code, where's it usually called from? Perhaps when I'm running the test suite, I see, well, this particular subroutine was called 2,000 times from here, and it was called 5 times from over here. So profilers aren't just useful for seeing when code is slow, they're useful for seeing where the common callers are, what's talking to what, how do things fit together. So as well as thinking about the code, exploring the code, understanding it, seeing how it fits together, I want to think about what good things belong in a code base. And I think all these are good things, and they all belong in there. But one thing I find myself doing, and I see other people doing, is sometimes adding these things for the sake of it. I worked with someone a few years ago who basically said to me once, Tom, more tests are good, we should have more tests. And I was thinking, but more tests take more time to run, they're slower. And for me, there's a bit like that thing about the tree falling over in the forest. If a test case never fails, if it never catches a problem, what value does that test case have? And likewise, 100% test coverage, you can still have bugs in code that has 100% coverage. yeah, logging's useful, but if you never have a production incident where you need to search through your logs to find a particular log line, what value does it have? And at this point, you might start feeling a bit suspicious and basically say, so Tom, are you asking me to have perfect knowledge of the future? And I think that's what I aim towards. I set my standards way too high. That's what I aim towards. And I'll never achieve this, but having some kind of mindfulness of what might happen based on previous experience is a useful approach. And not just putting things in because they are good, but trying to put in the most useful things. And I especially appreciate this when I am working with an old code base, because sometimes there can be lots of comments, documentation that just aren't relevant to today, because perhaps people updated the code and didn't update these other things. And the existence of these other things makes more work as your code base needs to become flexible. Now, all these things typically live in line alongside your code in your source code repository, so they are easier to update, they are easier to change. But most code bases will also have some kind of external resources outside of your version control system that talk about that code base. And having documentation for non-programmers, having blog posts, wiki articles is all useful stuff, but there's a much bigger risk of these things becoming out of date. So I think developers do write these things, developers do read these things, but it can be harder to keep those up to date. So this question again, so far, it's like, what else do developers do? So far I've been talking about code. We write code and we read code. But what else do we do? Am I trolling you? Meetings. There was that vegetarian slogan from the 1980s, wasn't there? Meetings mean murder, or it was something like that. That's probably true, but let's have a separate conversation outside. Yeah, so I think soft skills are important because people are important, because we're all interacting with people. A few years ago, I was having a really rough day at work, looked up at my desk, and a colleague at the same time looked up because he was having a rough day. And I was like, what's up? And he said, you know, Tom, the whole reason I did a maths degree was because I wanted to sit down and work on problems. The first couple of years of my maths degree, that was fine. In the final year, we had really difficult problems to work on. And I found the best way to understand maths was to sit around the kitchen table in my shared house with the other students and talk through the maths problems. And he said, the reason I became a software developer was because I wanted to work with computers, program computers, doing these logical things. And the more I programmed computers and dealt with people within companies, the more I found that I needed to talk to the other people about what the computers were doing. So basically, this poor colleague of mine had made the wrong life choice twice. I don't know what he's... This was about a decade ago, and I don't know what he's doing these days. So you are going to interact with people, and it is helpful. So I really just want to not give this talk and to sit in front of machines, but I found myself doing all the things I'm mentioning in this talk, not because they're what I really like, but because they need doing. And when you are interacting with people, it's important to understand that we're not all different. I think there are dominant personality types in software development. We're all quite sort of logical, rational people. But when I was last working as a permanent employee, my employer sent me on a day-long training course. And it wasn't like about doing cool stuff in Perl, so I thought it was going to be boring. And it was all about different personality types. And they got us to answer a questionnaire. And then based on people's answers, they put us into groups, into these 4 groups. For those of you who are interested in pursuing this further, I think it's called something like Hartman personality analysis. And what they said was, we put you into these 4 groups. And the first group of people are very much based around authority. They like hierarchy, structure, orders, things being kind of, you need to do this. The second group, which was by far the biggest, was the logical kind of thinking programmer type, and it's like, because this was an IT department, you know, these are the people who think things through, who need reasoned arguments. There was another group which was quite small, which was basically people who like to sit down and empathize with other people and understand their problems and kind of try and see things from the other person's point of view. And then the fourth personality type that they had was people who were like, come on, let's go do all this cool stuff. So the point of this was that to communicate, obviously this is generalization because there are more than 4 people in the world and we're not all clones of each other, but this is nonetheless a helpful generalization because each of these personality types requires a different way to get messages across to them. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine who's not in our industry, and she started nodding like mad, and I said, what? And she said, yeah, she said, when I started my job, every time I had an idea, I'd go up to my boss's desk, and I'd say, hey, I've got this idea. And it turns out that her boss was very much the kind of logical, reasonable computer programmer type. And I know so many programmers who have worked the other way around, where their boss comes up to them with this cool new idea, and they're like, oh no, not again. And so I told my friend this story, and she said, yeah, she said, I did that. But I've now realized that this isn't the best way to deal with my boss. So I think when you're doing one-to-one communication, understanding the communication technique that works best with the person you're talking to is good. And of course, you can go ask that person, say, hey, am I annoying you? And you can get a feel for what's working. What's really hard, of course, is a situation like this, where all of you have different experiences, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. And I'm trying to tell you a story for 20 minutes, and yeah, who knows what's going to happen there. So aside from personality, you've got the idea of communication. And what I've been talking about so far is kind of the expression. How do I say things? How do I express myself? And the other side of how does the recipient receive that information? Are we protocols? No, this isn't a technical talk, right? So yeah, interpersonal communication is hard, and I think we all know that. But there isn't a correct way of delivering a message, and there isn't a correct way of talking to people in general. But aside from that fuzzy interpersonal stuff that I'm bad at, that I know nothing about, but I'm trying to get better at, and I'm telling you about feeling somewhat guilty, there's technical communication. So let's imagine I start working with someone new, and this person has a task to work on. They say, can you explain this system to me? Now, pretty much every code base I've worked on, there's that simple 2-letter answer again. It's like, no, you don't want to know. But what I find myself doing when someone says to me, how does this system work, is I start drawing diagrams. And when I'm drawing diagrams, I've worked in places where someone will say to me, you should draw a diagram of the system. And it was only recently I realized why I don't like doing this. I think a diagram of the system, if it's accurate, ends up being the system. So this complicated code base you've got expressed in software, you've now got a picture which is just as complicated as the software and less readable. And so what I usually do when I'm creating diagrams is I think about the story I'm telling to the person I'm talking to, and I start sketching out the bits of the system, drawing lines between them, perhaps describing the data flow or the communications. And I'm really bad at drawing. I was like second to bottom in my art class at school. And my art teacher said to me, Tom, are you doing art next year? And I said, no. And he said, good. So even if you can't draw, diagrams are not about drawing. They're about giving people a way of looking at the system. And I'm a big fan of drawing diagrams for each conversation. And this is something I've picked up from other people. I've worked with people who I see explaining complicated systems to me, and they'll always scribble on a whiteboard or a bit of paper. Requirements are tricky things because, of course, what do developers do? Do we just write code? Well, quite often I've worked with people and I say, hey, why did you do it this way? And they say, oh, because it said so in the specification, or because such and such told me to. And I've also worked with developers who you say, hey, we need to work on this. And they go, but that's stupid. And it's like, okay. So it's a bit like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears thing. There's somewhere in the middle which is just right. And I think there's a real art to dealing with requirements. The requirements to start with are going to be wrong, and what you develop isn't going to be perfect. But the more conversation we have about what requirements are, the more that we iterate over this. And I like the agile idea of saying, what are we doing badly at? What are we doing well at? Because I've worked in a lot of places that have a tool for storing a specification and for tracking work. And I think people often act too rigidly about how to deal with requirements, how to have that technical communication. And there are different levels of a requirement. Of course, you have some idea of what you're going to do, but in order to challenge that, where challenge is a good thing, challenge is trying to do a better job, it helps to understand how you're going to do it and why you're doing it. And the more information you have at different levels, the easier it is to do this. And I'm certainly guilty if someone will come up to me and say, I need to do this, and I'll say, oh yeah, well, you just do that. But if I don't explain why I reached that conclusion, then it's much harder for people to say, but did you think about this? Or what would it be like if we did it this other way? So again, coming back to school and lessons, my maths teachers always taught me to work through my reasoning, not just to give the answer, but to explain how I'd got there. And I think that's important in what we do as well. Now, these are things that we find ourselves doing. Architecture is a thing we find ourselves doing all the time. I think nowadays the whole, here is how the system will be built, then the people go and build the system, is kind of funny, and I hope people don't do it too much. But architecture is something you discover over time through refactoring. And it's something that often isn't planned in work. So you kind of go and do it yourself. But again, I think knowing when to do these things is a matter of discussing them with the other people who know what you're working on. It's a part of a conversation, basically. And the final thing I want to discuss in terms of technical communication is that I see lots of people saying, you should do it this way. Be it in a conversation with colleagues, be it in a code review, whatever. I think it's much better not to go and tell someone how to do it, but open up your text editor. Go write the code. If in code review you say, well, I took your commits, and here's my commit that builds on top, that's far better than a whole load of comments. In fact, and I'm partly writing this because this week I said to someone who I work with, I'm really annoyed that we keep doing this. And he said, I know you are, Tom, you keep telling me. I was like, oh yeah, sorry. But 2 days later, he walked up to me with his laptop and he said, hey, I've got this branch in Git where I've tried doing what you suggested. And I'm like, oh no, what's this going to be? But the two of us spent an hour sat looking through the code he'd written. And he said, is this what you were thinking? And I said, wow, sort of. And I basically, the reason I've put this slide in here is because I felt quite guilty. I'd been saying to him, we should be doing it this way, right? Which basically means I'm just going to not do anything and you can do all the work. But what I should have done perhaps is knocked up more of a proof of concept. And it was helpful for me to look through his code. And yeah, there's some bits I'd sort of glossed over and really didn't work. So I think it's also helpful to share your doubts with people. Again, not the whole, it's not going to work, this is stupid. But so I don't think this is quite right. And even the doubts in your own ideas. So if I'm writing a proposal or a specification, obviously communicating with people you need to impress or external people is different to communicating with the people who are going to be dealing with the same crap that you're dealing with. But when you're trying to describe things to your colleagues, I think saying, well, I think this is going to work, or maybe I've done this so many times before, this is going to work, you probably don't want to write that because that sounds a bit show off. But yeah, if you've got some hesitation, try to include that in your plans. So yeah, this has been a bit of an all-over-the-place kind of talk, because for me this has been an all-over-the-place kind of year where I've been having various ideas, bouncing out, working with people. This is sort of what I've been doing, so if what I'm saying doesn't make a great deal of sense to you, that's great, because it doesn't to me either. But I wanted to share what I've been thinking of. So I hope that kind of the conclusion we've reached from this, in answer to the question, is that no, development isn't more than writing code. That's all it is. And do we have any questions? No. No, wait a minute. No, do we have time for questions? Yeah. We've kind of got this weird ad hoc peer-to-peer thing with the timekeeping, which is probably a Ponzi scheme. But Hugo, what's your...
I was slightly confused about the show don't tell thing. Certainly for me, code review is a primary source for me for mentoring.
Okay.
It's the opportunity I use to say, well, here's 3 different ways you could have written it.
So Hugo's point is that in code review, it's very helpful to not just show, but to tell, to kind of... I think this depends on the roles of the different people involved. Yeah, certainly sometimes you don't want to write the person's code for them. And I mean, if I were to put some code that I had written into review, and I was like, hey, I've written this cool code, and you replied to me saying, well, Tom, actually, I've rewritten it because it was rubbish. I'm not going to be too happy with that. So, yeah, a lot of this is perhaps specific to my experience, perhaps a reaction to things I've seen a lot. And I don't think any of these are things you should always do. I think they're things to consider and try and use when appropriate. I think it's 3:20 now. I'm going to be around for the rest of the conference, and I assume I'll be around this evening. Come and talk to me about this stuff. Basically, if this is like a crowdsourcing thing, you a lot better ideas than me, so come and tell me your really good ideas. And thank you for listening.